So,
This meeting is being recorded.
okay, here we go again. So the point I wanted to make regarding Tosca is that decomposition, the Tosca decomposition, could happen directly in FU. There are open source parsers for Tosca, including one that I wrote, which is written in Go and could be very easy to integrate into the current topology controller. So to go back to Stephen's diagram, we have that NF topology CRD, which is our input for the topology controller, but there's nothing really blocking us from reading Tosca directly, right? So if you have a higher level service orchestrator and it creates an NSD in Tosca, we could potentially take it directly into the topology controller. It could read that C star directly and then do exactly the same thing it's doing right now. But again, instead of using a KRM based approach, which has the CRD in as an NF topology, that it would be an NSD packaged as a CSAR that we would consume. So again, there are a lot of questions here about which level it works, and are we doing decomposition in Nefio, or do we want to keep it at a higher level orchestrator? I think post R1, if we start trying to integrate Nefio into existing flows of orchestrators, I think that will teach us a lot more about what we should be doing. But again, this is the SIG, I think, where a lot of these requirements will have to be generated. Thought?
I'm not sure Bonaj came first or not. Me, I have some question for you.
Sure.
Okay, so I would like to discuss a little bit sort of the scope of what we are trying to manage from a slightly different angle. You've now started with this process view and tried to sort of derive out of this process flow the demarcation line between the responsibilities of Nefio and the service orchestrator. My sort of primitive thinking when I first saw the Nefio's 3-column approach, infrastructure, cloud native network functions, and then the configuration, and was asking myself, where would I sort of then differentiate sort of what the service orchestrator would be doing? I came up with an analogy of software packages such as a database process. That means I can try to manage the host of the database. That would be the first column. I can try to think of sort of deploying the software, let's say a MySQL cluster onto that host. That would be the second column. And the third column would be related to the configuration of the MySQL service in such a manner that it, for instance, finds its file systems where it can store its data, might also sort of set up logging, etc. But it wouldn't take care of establishing any kind of database schemas, adding users, and adding any kind of access credentials. That would be related to this, let's say, service orchestration part. That means from a sort of a primitive sort of understanding, basically Nefio could, for instance, focus on making sure that the software processes are installed correctly, running correctly, and then can be configured to account for any kind of service usage as needed via the SO. That means that would be sort of a deliberate demarcation line when we're saying that the software processes are up and running, they can reach to whatever kind of communication partners they need. And apart from that, they are not providing a service at that point in time. And then on top of that, you've got the whole life cycle and the life cycle management of the services, which have their own right of being sort of managed in a sort of accounting for dependencies, etc.
I think that's a great analogy. Yeah, I think that's great, right? Because it's exactly that. First, you want to deploy MySQL, and let's imagine a more complicated case where MySQL, yes, you need to assign it storage, but you want really high performance storage. Maybe this is MySQL for a very heavy application. So you want maybe a network accelerator too to make sure that clients can connect to MySQL fast. So all of these are requirements that you want to set up. So Nefio would take care exactly of that, making sure that your infrastructure requirements are specified and a Kubernetes cluster is stood up with those requirements, right? If it requires, say, some kernel driver, like we do right now for Free 5GC UPF, it makes sure to stand it up. And then you have basically MySQL up, but it doesn't have any tables in it, right? So the next step, right, in this flow would be to actually configure MySQL with the tables that you need for your particular application, right? Which in this case would be our network service, right? The network service is the application.
Yes.
I think what could help us moving forward is this step here that's called configure. Now, configuration is an extremely big word in telco, right? It is our main meat, right? Provisioning and standing things up is relatively trivial to the actual active configuration. But the problem is that configuration bleeds into everything. We call everything configuration. And FEOA has this concept of configuration as data, right? And which we're doing everything with KRM declaratively. And some of those aspects are configurations, right? Network attachments, for example. But then there's configuration that also happens after that. So I think what could help us move forward is to take this configure step and really break it down. And I think that could add clarity into which aspects of configuration are part of NFEO and are in its scope and which are not, which are things that are really belong to a different level of orchestration. Yeah, this has not been something that's been done, I think, in telco quite yet, right? Because configuration, I think, is taken almost for granted. But we need to start decomposing configuration, if you will, right? And maybe even finding better terminology for it, right? Because configuration can cover netconf. It can cover configuring Linux kernels for for deployment, configuring BIOS for the machine racks before you actually install the operating systems on the nodes. There's so many aspects to this configuration, but we need absolute clarity on what goes where. That is my thinking. But yeah, I think that's a great analogy of the database, right?
Todd, may I ask a question?
Sure. This is an open discussion, right? So it's not,
Okay.
I don't have all the answers. Yeah.
So talking about this decomposition of service, let's say you're starting from NSD. So typically the service orchestration, the Tosca, whatever the format coming in, they look at initially end-to-end service orchestration. Some service contain multiple service network services. For each services, they decompose further to find out which is underlying the network function and their network connection, and also cluster affinity, all kind of information in there. So that's why usually the NFEO or NFO in Oren, they handle all decomposition, and then so they know what to connect each other, and they know where they deploy, which cluster deploy. So those decomposition have enough information. So that's why I agree that the network topology controller, I think for R1, I think this is to me as used as a simulator to me. Service orchestra simulator kind of, so to make it trigger the nephew. But reality, real scenario, that is the proper NFO. They decompose, they find out network function, then using some interface, they interface nephew, can you deploy this network function, like for example, AMF, UPF, and the SMF. Each one, using they cycle, and they call nephew one by one. And then once they get it, they know, they also tell which cluster they're gonna deploy. And then also they know how to connect each other. So they have all the information. So that's why I'm not clear network topology controller in here in this picture. So that's why I tried to ask you, what's your view here? So you already mentioned about network topology controller could be optional in this picture. And I don't know what's the foreseeing your vision here. How to trigger nephew.
Right, and you kind of put, I very specifically did not want to take a slide from Etsy. Etsy has their own version of this, which indeed has levels of orchestrators, right? There's service, there's SO, and beyond it, there is the NFO, right? So there's there's two levels and a kind of two levels of decomposition done as well. So I was very careful not to try to do that because that complicates it a little bit more. Here we have service orchestration kind of going directly into the network functions, right? We have an opportunity, I think, in NFU to rethink some of these relationships of orchestration. I don't know exactly where NF topology would fit in. As I said, there are two options. So for us, for NFU-R1, NF topology is very useful for setting up our use case all at once, right? Because we can create a single CRD that will deploy everything. So yes, as you said, it functions as our SO. But the idea, of course, is nobody is going to create those NF topology instances manually necessarily as a way to deploy, right? There is probably a higher level orchestrator that will do it for you. So we'll generate maybe those NF topology CRs, or the higher level orchestrator would work more directly with NFU primitives. So again, I think we have two options here. And if we do want to take NF topology and make it more useful for higher level service orchestrators, it could evolve in R2 into something a little bit different. But we don't know exactly what the requirements are. We need a real use case with a real orchestrator that is actually being used, and see what ways an FU can fit into the current flow. And this is just an example in ONAP. Again, it's not even exactly how ONAP works, but it's a little bit similar, right? Most orchestrators that I'm familiar with have a certain workflow. They have this idea of create, provision, configure, activate, post-configure, right? Every orchestrator has its own model for its workflow, right? So yeah, there's a lot of thinking we need to do moving forward, right? And this is just an opening shot to that conversation. And there are aspects too, we talked a little bit about ETSI and its structure, and if we want to support ETSI style NSDs, right, using the ETSI Tosca models, so there's already a strong opinion there how to define network services, right? Do we want to plug into that directly? We could. We have the option. Technologically, we absolutely can. There are pros and cons. We can do that, and we can do more. We can actually support multiple ways of connecting NFU to higher level orchestrators, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a discussion at the NFU event last time talking about one person said talking to SC Sol 005 coming into NFO. That's fine, but southbound of the NFO talking to NFU, we cannot use Sol 3, right? So that means that we need to define the scope or granularity of the connection point to the NFU, and then also mechanism. We're not using the push-based command line like Sol 3. We need to following the pool model, which NFU supporting CRD and CR and then triggering point and also CD mechanism. So I'm very curious about this interface between the first blue box and then second down blue box, of which represent NFU in this case. So so we need to study on that, and who's gonna decompose the services and how we're gonna connecting that to NFU, and NFU NTO NTC bump up into service level, then they handle all the interface up with the upper layer, and then talking the NFU different mechanism like a CRD, CR. So we need to discuss. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, and one of our biggest challenges is that the previous models that we had from ETSI and SOL3 and really the whole Tosca design comes from the VNF world. and the VNF world, we had a very clear workflow where first you had to provision the resources, the virtual machines, and then you start configuring them. But Kubernetes flips everything on its head, right? Because Kubernetes is not a Vim, right? So the infrastructure and the workloads are deployed together, and they're deployed declaratively. So we're kind of combining phases together, and we're making our life easier in many ways because Kubernetes is so much more capable, and at least in terms of orchestration than OpenStack was, or the what I will call the legacy cloud platforms that we have. So we're able to combine some of these phases together, right? The declarative approach allows us to kind of break away from that chicken and egg problem of having to provision and then having to instantiate, where we can instantiate and provision all at once. But it's also a challenge for a higher level design and our interaction for a higher level design, because we didn't think of provisioning that way. So yeah, this is going to be a challenge for us. And I think it would be really best if we have real POCs with real orchestrators trying to connect to Nefio. So I think after Nefio R1, we will actually have a set of components that could be used. And we, I think as a community, have to start integrating.
Yeah.
I think another thing we need to do is to reach out to many of these orchestrator companies, because they haven't been involved in Nefio very much so far. And maybe that will be easier post R1.
I think that from me, that's the beauty of the Nephew. Instead of the orchestrating, each one, they do the declaratively and using pool model choreography way. So that's why the instance service, create service instance configuration, they can handle declaratively. So each component, each controller, they can pull the event from the source of truth, and they can handle interactively. That's why, to me, the operator doesn't have to orchestrate every single detail one by one, assign service, create service, configure service, activate. So I think that we have to different way, a Nephew way, but we have to think about a little differently.
Right, and we're careful always not to boil the ocean, right? We don't want to revolutionize things so much that it can't integrate into the existing universe. So I think that's what we have to think of really moving forward. And for example, the whole issue of supporting Helm, right? We also don't want to create a system that can't interact with existing packages, right? So I think we might end up having multiple integration points, right? So there would be a way you could use NF topology controller to do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. And that means we might have to beef it up, its capabilities moving forward in R2. Or we need to clarify how you interact actually with the lower level primitives in Nefio. Configuration as data is a very, very powerful approach, but the devil's in the details, as I like to say. Who is in charge of which parts of the data? Some of them are inputs into Nefio, but some of them are outputs from Nefio, right? Because once Nefio finishes and everything is stood up and running, to use Bernard's metaphor, the database is up right now. Now you have to create its schemas, and that happens from a different level that is not part of Nefio's scope, right? Nefio is in charge of bringing up those network functions correctly. But what happens next is that they have to integrate into the network as a whole. So we have to make sure that our outputs are clear too, right? The data that comes out from us, this is part of the Google Seed component that we have, the status aggregator. Make sure that the status comes in a way that could be read from a higher level orchestrator and be used to start making those service connections, right? The activation.
Hey Tal, so I had another thing. So the example that Bernard you gave, MySQL, I think in a simplistic single instance context, it makes a lot of sense, right? And I'm aligned with you, but I think the complexity comes in terms of business logic split brain when you do things at scale, right? If you want to, let's say, bring up SQL servers for serving certain capacity in a cross region with certain replication parameters and placement logic and so forth, right? How do you demarcate in that point what would fit in the lower domain orchestrator versus in the upper domain, right?
That's for me still for me infrastructure. Replication and sort of deployment in a distributed setup is still infrastructure, whereas sort of again the content and who's allowed to access the content and possibly any kind of business logic which you might want to also co-locate with this with the database would be related to the service. So again, it's more about if we're saying that the network or the functions which we are deploying are up and running and can be configured to account for services. That would be my demarcation point and the handover to the service orchestrator. That means I wouldn't want to go into the nitty-gritty of trying to explain to a high-level orchestrator what kind of replication parameters they have to configure in order to do an upgrade when upgrading the database software package. So this is something which is going to kill any kind of designer, because then he would have to go into the nitty-gritty. So I would like to have a demarcation point where we say the software process as such, without the service configuration, is the demarcation point for the Nephew domain. And on top of that, then the actual service configuration can happen.
Yeah, Bernard, that makes a lot of sense. Again, I didn't mean to necessarily having to enumerate, but my request to especially the telcos and SIG1 is to come up with these key day 0, 1 to real world scenarios. And in that contextually explain the demarcation between SO and what Nephew would be, right? Unless we go to that level of detail, it's hard for people to always conceive in terms of the right demarcation points.
Yeah, so my thoughts here simply would be actually to have an interaction also with Ericsson, Nokia, Marvini, etc., and talk about them, tell them would it be possible to try to establish over the time this split? Yeah, and could you come up with criteria and guidance regarding the network functions which you are actually programming to say, can we somehow make sure that what we're doing in this initial configuration via Nephew is clearly separated from what we're doing related to the service configuration? And to be honest, if I'm looking at real world examples, I see, for instance, that a lot of configuration for the services happening via netconf, and the basic configuration is happening by the typical Helm charts, etc., which are being used to deploy a solution. There is already this notion of, yes, we have to account for these two different types of life cycles and changes. And we could try to come up with a working group trying to establish this demarcation line.
Yeah, perfect. I just wanted to again park it with especially the telcos in SIG1. And yes, we should pull in, of course, the NF vendors in terms of ensuring whatever we end up planning as the demarcation points is realistic vis-a-vis what the current realities are.
Yes.
Yeah, and what I'm hoping for is to be able to reach out to some of these orchestration vendors and have them involved as well. We have ONAP that's open source, and we can use that as an example. We have EMCO, right, a smaller project. And let's not forget our work with ORAN, right, which is more at the infrastructure level, at the O2 IMS level. But it ties into this discussion too, right? Because this is exactly about infrastructure, right? The big challenge here is infrastructure. That is by far the biggest one, right? The workloads themselves are more straightforward, but it's making sure that that chicken and egg dance between, okay, the network function has the requirements for the Linux kernel, so we can specify those requirements declaratively, but who is actually going to provision that Linux kernel and install it, right? So there's the platform vendor, but then all of this has to tie into an orchestration narrative that's very clear. Who is in charge of what? And there are different narratives from different vendors. Google does things differently from Red Hat, right? And we want to make sure that all those narratives can be there. So, with Nephew R1, we were very careful to break things down into primitive building blocks, right? But we don't always know who is actually going to provide that CR, who is going to specify it. By who, I mean what, right? Because this is all about automation. So there is a higher level orchestrator that will be generating these inputs for Nephew. But we don't have that integration quite yet, right? So I really think we need to start building these POCs, showing how it is possible, and exploring the different kinds of narratives that are there, and have just very clear stories about it, right? Because until now, honestly, we've been waving our hands a little bit around it. We're saying, here are all these primitives. You assemble them into a whole. but we need those stories clear, in my opinion.
Agree.
Tal, I think I had a couple of questions around this. So I was looking at this NF topology. Before I think I would go ahead, I think probably this is Girish. I'm from Infosys and just trying to trying to get into nephew and understand how things are working out here, and probably we can also contribute in some way if possible. So I think I guess as I can see, NF topology is pretty much I think aligned to what is NSD is. I think probably somebody also has indicated the same thing, right? I think on the way I think NSD has all your BNFs and connection points and virtual links and all. I think you kind of emulating the same aspects and I believe for translating from NSD to NF topology, some possible I think approach we can go with, right, as a possible integration approach. But I think Byung also mentioned that we probably would not be then touching anywhere in the BNF aspects, right? To be kind of working at the NS level in service orchestrator, right? Just passing on the NSD, converting into NF topology, and then kind of pushing it to nephew and nephew to the rest of the things, right? And that would take care of probably lifecycle management aspect of it, the NS. Are you also looking at probably the package management aspect of it, right? Especially the VNF and all, any kind of integration we are planning there?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the question. We can have the nephew topology controller consume CSARs directly. There doesn't have to be a higher level translation. So we can really ease the work of higher level orchestrators, and they can talk to nephew directly in the language that they already know, if it's Tosca. So that's possible, but you know, there are a lot of details. As you pointed out, it's the vendor specific configuration. So Tosca is an object oriented language. So part of the way the NSDs are used, yes, there are base types provided by Etsy SOLs, but then vendors could extend those types, inherit them, and add properties that are specific to them. So if you have a CSAR for a specific topology, it's not generic, right? It would have types for, say, Nokia, Samsung, Huawei, etc. And you know, we can do this right now already in FUR1. As we said, we have just this general UPF, and we match it to a free 5GC UPF, right? But we could provide configurations that are very specific for specific vendors. So in the Kubernetes world, it's a little bit different. You don't inherit a type. You simply create a new type, a CR, and you can associate them together, right? So we've been slowly evolving a meta model in Nephew as kind of a way to associate, if you will, a general abstract type with more specific types that are vendors specific to specific vendors. So really, I think you're right. You know, what we're doing is compatible in many ways with what's happening in Tosca. And to the point, Tosca is declarative, right? Tosca and Kubernetes were basically released at about the same year. And they took very similar approaches, right? A declarative approach to orchestration. And you know, we even have a history of that with OpenStack Heat, which was even earlier, right? So I think we learned a lot that declarative orchestration is the way to go. But the devil is in the details, right? Who's declaring? That's the issue that is important to me. Who is actually creating those declarations? Because some of that are manual. There is a solution architect designing a topology for a specific customer, a particular network service. But then a lot of it is generated automatically too. And we need to sort this out, at least from Nephio's perspective.
And who's declaring the model, and then who's packaging the CRD, and then who's the packaging going into the Nephew catalog and then distribute and hydration. And then we don't want to destroy the Nephew this architecture to interface with the upper bound. Upper bound has to honor what Nephew handling declarative way and package management, hydration, and all the automated based on Kubernetes architecture. So yeah, good item to think about.
Yeah, the narrative right now is a little bit complex. We have two different maybe avenues for getting input data into Nefio. There is injection of data, but there's also specialization of data automatically. Which is part of the power, but with this power comes again, trying to understand how this will interact with other systems is something we have to continue discussing. Ms. Kaushik, I think you've had your hand up for a while, but please jump in.
Hey, that was a stale hand from the previous discussion that I
okay.
had. But I also
Oh, I think-
realized we are at time, so we
Yes.
should wrap it up.
Yes, I will say I'm working on a blog that will be published as part of our public relations spree after R1, which I actually discuss some aspects of this, and I'm still working on it. So this discussion is actually helping me think through some of the points I want to make. But really thinking about the next step of Nefio would be exactly that. How do we make Nefio actually work within existing telco flows? All right. I can keep talking for hours, but I won't.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen and Tal, for the discussion. And I think I have taken some of the action items for SIG1 to both define the network architecture, define the specific scenarios, roles and responsibilities between SO and Nefio and so forth. This will be part of the subgroups that I described earlier. For each of the subgroups, we'll create clear ownership, deliverables, and how that feeds into the main group and so forth. So please expect something by end of this week on what the subgroups focus areas and the structure would be. And then we'll request people to vote for who would want to be leading each of those subgroups. Of course, we'll need time commitment and so forth, but we'll work with you to realize that outcome. And with that, we should. Was there anything else logistically that anyone else wanted to bring up? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for the great discussion today. Have a good rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great discussion.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.